From Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. And for you today, an extended conversation with Washburn University's Roger McEowen as he'll go over his top 10 agricultural law developments of 2018, many of which are carrying over into this new year, Roger says. Among the issues he'll discuss, multiple court actions revolving around the Waters of the U.S. rule, litigation concerning air emission reporting for livestock operations, and a court decision on habitat preservation for endangered wildlife species. Plus, the item that reached number 1 on Roger's list. We'll get going on that countdown in a moment. Further ahead with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas, K-State's Gus Vanderhoeven. Right here on Agriculture Today. Agricultural producers, landowners, and creditors, you have a partner in your legal and financial needs. Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services offers reliable, trusted information and guidance. Whether you need advice for ag credit concerns or are transitioning your operation to the next owner, Kansas Agricultural Mediation Services can assist you in making sound decisions for your business. To learn more, call 800-321-3276 or visit us online. You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network, and welcome once more to Agriculture Today. Well, as with most years, 2018 was eventful in the agricultural law and taxation arena. In fact, our guest annually compiles his top 10 agricultural law developments, and today he will remark on the importance of these to the agricultural sector and why they made this list. Roger McEowen is with us via phone once again. Roger is a professor of agricultural law and taxation at the Washburn University School of Law. And by what criteria do you select 10 developments or stories out of the mass of things that are going on out there, Roger?
Well, I look at things based on their impact to ag producers and agribusinesses and the associated professional service businesses that service farmers and ranchers and agribusinesses on a nationwide basis. So, for example, we may have a very big issue that is just kind of a regional issue or a state issue or a local issue, although it could be monumental in that particular area. It's not probably going to make my list because it doesn't have nationwide application. One of those, for example, would be we've had issues in Kansas and Missouri and parts of the Midwest with respect to dicamba over the past couple of years. Well, that's an important issue, and that's a big issue for those that are impacted by it. But in terms of a nationwide development that impacts the sector as a whole, no, that's not going to make my list. So that's how I look at it. What are the big nationwide impact issues that's going to impact the way that a farmer or rancher does their business from a legal standpoint, from a tax standpoint? That's what I'm after.
On that basis, then, let us walk through those top 10 agricultural law and taxation developments of 2018, and we'll do it in traditional countdown order, starting with number 10. This is a tax issue directly, and it deals with what are called the passive loss deduction rules, and a ruling on that score was made in 2018, you say.
Yeah, actually, it's a combination of two things going on in this case. This is Robinson versus Commissioner. It's a tax court memo opinion in the summer of 2018. And normally a memo opinion wouldn't make it, but this is such a big deal because the tax court combined two issues here together. And we've never seen them combined like this at the tax court level before. And there's really a big lesson here for farmers and ranchers. And if IRS is going to take this position going out into the future, then we've got big issues. What this involved was the purchase of a ranch by non-farmers in southeastern Utah. It's run down. They fix it up. They start running horses for a while. They don't make money at that, so they switch to a cattle ranching operation. They've got grazing rights on Bureau of Land Management land, and they're building a herd. They hire a ranch manager. So they pay him. They've got ranch hands that live there, and they were putting in a lot of work in this. It was a husband and wife pair that bought it, but they kept losing money year after year, about 15 years of losses every single year. Well, they went through 3 audits over the period of 15 years, and on the third audit, each time, keep in mind, the IRS was asserting that they were a hobby. The first two audits resulted in the IRS concluding, okay, we're not going to change anything. We agree that you're not a hobby. But then the IRS came back in on a third audit about 3 years after the second audit, and different auditors this time asserting hobby, and this time they wouldn't give up on that. And they said, we think you're a hobby. And so these losses you cannot deduct on your return. And these are massive losses. It's a big number. And then what happens is they get to the tax court, and the tax court judge, while saying that they were not a hobby, therefore they could deduct their losses under the hobby loss rules, they weren't restricted there, they said the fact that you hired a paid ranch manager eliminates all of your hours that you participate in the activity. And there is a Treasury regulation on this. I've lectured on this for years, but we never had a case. I always wondered whether IRS would hang their hat on that. Well, IRS didn't assert this. This was the tax court judge that brought it up on her own motion. And she said, because you hired that paid ranch manager, I can't count any of your hours toward the activity. Therefore, even though you're not a hobby, you're passive. And so all your losses are passive. Now, the result of that, Eric, is not as bad as being a hobby, because if you're a hobby, you just can't deduct your losses. Well, if you're deemed to be passive, then your losses stay suspended until you sell the activity. So the lesson here is IRS is hot on the trail of hobby loss issues. They are auditing those. And then now they've got another weapon, thanks to the tax court, is that if you clear the hobby loss hurdle, you could still be deemed to be passive and then have limited deductions from your losses. So we got to be careful with that with respect to farming and ranching activities. If you hire a ranch manager and you have losses, none of your hours are going to count. And so you could get caught up in the passive loss rules. Really harsh rule.
Number 9 on your list, well, this revolves around a highly popular, widely used insecticide and the registration of that insecticide product. That was at issue in this situation.
Right. This is the Lorsban case. Chlorpyrifos. It's known as, commonly known as Lorsban, the Dow AgroScience chemical. What that does is it targets pests such as soybean aphids and spider mites and corn rootworms. That chemical is used on about 8 million soybean acres in the U.S. That's about 10% of the entire U.S. planted soybean acreage. But you've got environmental groups that went after that and basically convinced the court that that was harmful to children, and therefore the court took the very unusual step in the middle of 2018 to revoke and cancel all the licensing for and the tolerances and the registrations for Lorsban. And that I've never seen a court do that before. They just take a chemical on its own motion, a herbicide or pesticide, right off the market. USDA objected to that substantially, and they said, "Court, you're not looking at the science that we have used over many years to evaluate these types of agricultural chemicals. You're just taking the plaintiff's word for it that it's bad, and you're relying on their science and the EPA's science, and we don't agree with that." Well, unfortunately, it didn't look like the USDA science got actually admitted into evidence during the court proceedings, and so it wasn't before the court. But that's a real big problem, and I wonder whether a rehearing has been asked in this case. I wonder ultimately whether the Trump administration will ask the U.S. Supreme Court to hear this matter.
It is important to note then, as you're saying, though, that this is still in litigation. There's to be many arguments yet expressed on this.
Yeah, very late in 2018, the EPA petitioned for a rehearing with the full U.S. Court of Appeals for the Ninth Circuit. Again, this was the Ninth Circuit that did this, and it's a 3-judge panel that made the ruling to cancel the registrations. They've asked for a rehearing by the full panel. There's a 60-day time frame for revocation and cancellation that is suspended. Of course, the court said you got to cancel and revoke your registrations within 60 days of my ruling. Well, the court suspended that pending the court deciding whether they're going to rehear the case. I would think if the rehearing's not granted, then we might see the Trump administration ask the U.S. Supreme Court to hear the case. Now, in any event, I think that Lorsban is going to continue to be available to producers in 2019 as these legal proceedings continue.
Item number 8 on your list, well, it's one of several that fall under the general umbrella of water issues. This one is a wetland determination, and to cut to the chase, on frozen soil as this case played out. What was the story here, Roger?
Well, this is a case, again, we're back in the Ninth Circuit, and unfortunately we see a number of important ag decisions from year to year come out of the Ninth Circuit, and many times when they come out of the Ninth Circuit, they're not favorable to agriculture or agricultural productions. And indeed, this is one of those cases. And this case came from the North Pole in Alaska, and it's a wetland case. And basically, to cut the story short here, was you had a landowner that was looking to expand their business, and they acquired a tract of land up at the North Pole, and they needed to clear some timber and prepare the bed to put up some of their buildings. And so as they were doing that, they had the requisite permits, and they get ready to gravel the area that they had cleared. And the EPA and the Army Corps of Engineers came in and said, well, based on a manual that we have used back in the 1980s and the 1990s, we have changed the definition of what a wetland is such that it could apply to frozen soil, in other words, the permafrost up near the North Pole in this situation. So you need a federal NPDES discharge permit before you can level that off and apply the gravel to make your bed to put buildings and structures on that property. Really, the wetland issue comes back to the internal books and memos and manuals that the agencies use for defining what a wetland is and how they determine what a wetland is. They had an 87 manual the Corps did for delineating wetlands. And under that manual, what this business owner is doing up at the North Pole would not constitute disturbing a wetland. But in 1989, the Corps adopted a new manual that superseded the 87 manual and loosened up that definition so that it would apply in this type of situation. And the Ninth Circuit agreed with that. And so they were free to use their changed definition of how they would delineate a wetland. So it's an issue with respect to agency manuals. It's a really tough decision, but it does insert a lot more uncertainty into the already murky legal status of what a water of the United States is. So perhaps in 2019, we might see the U.S. Supreme Court hear the case. They will be asked to hear this one, and it's an important one in terms of holding government agencies accountable to the will of Congress.
Well, we will step aside for a couple of moments now and then return and continue the rundown on Roger McEowen's top 10 agricultural law developments of 2018. You're listening to Agriculture Today.
Agriculture and food systems are the main drivers of the Kansas economy, but must be improved in order to feed the world's growing population. How are we going to do so? Reduce food loss, find ways to preserve grasslands, and help families stretch their dollars. Global food systems is one of the 5 grand challenges K-State Research and Extension is addressing. To learn more, visit www.ksre.ksu.edu.
Agriculture Today is back now and resuming the countdown of the top 10 agricultural law and taxation developments of 2018, as put together by Washburn University's Roger McEowen. And we'll pick right back up, Roger, with number 7 on the list. This is an endangered species case, and it addressed what constitutes conservation habitat in protection of said species.
Yeah, this was the endangered dusky gopher frog case that made it all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court in 2018. This was a unanimous 8-0 reversal of what the Fifth Circuit had decided in 2016. We don't see 8-0 reversals very often, but this one was so out in left field that all the justices could agree that what the Fifth Circuit did was wrong. And of course, what's at issue here was an Endangered Species Act case, the dusky gopher frog. And when the Secretary of the Interior designates a particular species, plant or animal, as endangered or in threatened status, then they have to delineate the habitat for that particular species, where they're going to be protected at. Well, there is a special rule that allows the critical habitat to include areas outside the geographical area that's occupied actually by the species at the time it is listed, if the United States Fish and Wildlife Service determines that those areas are essential for conservation of the species. And it can include presently unoccupied critical habitat. What the government claimed in this instance was, well, we want an area that used to be habitat prior to 1965. No, we know you haven't seen any dusky gopher frogs in those areas for almost 50 years. But, if you change the area a bit to put it the way it was before 1965, then the dusky gopher frog could live there. And the Fifth Circuit said, well, that's right. We're going to designate that particular area as critical habitat. Well, it was an area that had been purchased, a 1,500-acre site by developers, and they had millions of dollars sunk into it, and the frog hadn't been seen there since 1965. Okay. And so then their investment is out the window because they would be halted in terms of developing that property if that becomes critical habitat. And so their argument was, now, wait a minute. Before you designate critical habitat, it actually has to be habitat. There hasn't been a frog seen in these parts, they said, since 1965. The U.S. Supreme Court said unanimously, yes, before the government can designate critical habitat, it must be habitat. It kind of makes sense, I think. And so the court said just a common dictionary sense reading of the term gets you that result.
It's nice to see common sense prevail for once in the court
system. And that's a
system.
big deal because there's a lot of these types of species that end up showing up on private property. And so if the government can expand the reach of the definition of habitat, that would apply on potentially a lot of farm and ranch land across the country. But the U.S. Supreme Court pinned the government back on that.
Moving up then to number 6 on the list. This is out of South Dakota. It was a remote seller's sales tax imposed in that state, and the constitutionality of that tax was at issue here.
That's right. This is the Wayfair decision by the U.S. Supreme Court involving South Dakota legislation. South Dakota doesn't have a state income tax, and so what they were trying to do was to get sales and use tax basically from online sellers that didn't have a physical presence in the state of South Dakota, but South Dakota people would buy the product. So it's somebody that might be in Kansas, somebody that might be in Iowa, that sells into the state of South Dakota, does it online. Their business operation is not in South Dakota. They don't have a physical presence there, and so the argument has been for all these years, the Constitution requires you to have a physical presence in the jurisdiction that is taxing you. And there have been a couple of Supreme Court cases over the years, one back in the 1960s and one in the early 1990s that said that that's the case. You have to have a physical presence. Well, in Wayfair, the court went the other direction, and they said, no, there has to be a nexus with the state. Physical presence is no longer the only way that you can satisfy the nexus requirement. There has to be a connection, and physical presence is not the only way to satisfy that connection. And so this now opens the door up for states such as Kansas and Nebraska and Iowa and elsewhere to impose sales and use tax on remote sellers. And I think the repercussions would be particularly harsh on small rural businesses, somebody selling out of their home in a rural area, for example, that simply does not have the staff or doesn't have the software to calculate what the tax is in every single municipal or county or whatever the taxing jurisdiction is that's trying to levy sales and use tax. And there are thousands of those all across the country. However, in the Supreme Court opinion, they said, well, if a state models their legislation after what South Dakota did, then it will be constitutional. And what South Dakota did was create an exemption here for small numbers of sellers in terms of volume or numbers of sales during the year or amount of sales. You've got to clear a threshold before you can impose use tax, sales or use tax on the buyers of those products. So I think that's going to exempt out a lot of the smaller businesses. You've got to clear that particular hurdle. And so it'll be important where the state set those hurdles at. But not everyone would be subject to sales and use tax on remote sellers that don't have a physical presence in the state. You've got to get over a minimum threshold first. And that, I think, is the key point.
All right. Number 5, here's the Clean Water Act again. This particularly gets into pollution discharge through groundwater.
Yeah, in fact, Eric, in 2018, we had 2 federal circuit courts of appeal that said, discharge through groundwater into a water in the United States requires a federal NPDES permit. That was the Ninth Circuit. Again, we're back to the Ninth Circuit. They said that, as well as the Fourth Circuit. Now, the Sixth Circuit later in the year said no. Discharges into groundwater that then flow into a water in the United States are not subject to the NPDES permit system under the Clean Water Act. Why is this a big deal? Well, this is huge because if you think of irrigated crop agriculture, then the government could argue that we've got a discharge into groundwater, gets into the underground water table that eventually flows into a water of the United States, as that term is defined. If that's the case, then this has huge ramifications for irrigated agriculture all over the country. And so now we've got a split between the circuits. We've got two circuits that said, yeah, we can regulate that. The government can regulate that. That requires a federal permit. One court that says no. I would not be surprised if we see this issue in the lap of the U.S. Supreme Court in 2019.
And hopefully some clarification on what amounted to a mixed message with two very distinctly different rulings in this area. Number 4, then, the exemption of agricultural operations from air quality emissions reporting to the Environmental Protection Agency. Now, this has been bandied about for quite a few years as to what kind of liabilities would ensue on agricultural operations regarding air pollution, right?
Yeah, that's right. This has been going on since at least 2008. It was in that year that the EPA issued a final regulation that exempted farms from the reporting or notification requirement for air releases from animal waste on the basis that a federal response would most often be impractical and unlikely. And basically what the government is saying, this is not what we're really concerned about under the CERCLA law, the Environmental Response Compensation Liability Act, or the Emergency Planning Community Right to Know Act, where the government under those rules is to be notified when you've got large quantities of hazardous materials that are released into the environment. They said, we're thinking of factories and commercial-type business operations. We're not thinking of farms where you've got odors that are emitted. But the EPA did keep in place the reporting notification requirement for confined animal feeding operations. So CAFO still had to report. Well, what happened was that ended up in litigation. A lot of environmental groups, or some environmental groups, challenged that exemption on the basis that the EPA acted outside of the scope of its authority to create the exemption. So they said, you can't create this exemption. And then you had some ag groups, on the other hand, that claimed that the retained reporting requirement that still applied for CAFOs was also impermissible. So you got two different arguments here from two different diametrically opposed groups. You got environmental groups on one side, you got farm groups on the other side. So this gets into the courts, and then in 2017, you've got, notice how long this goes on. The court held, this is the Federal Circuit Court for D.C., they said, well, the final reg should be vacated, and in other words, get rid of it as an unreasonable interpretation of the de minimis exception in the statute. So the challenge brought by the ag groups to the CAFO carve-out then was mooted. It was dismissed. Well, that potentially subjected about 50,000 farms to the additional reporting requirements under those two federal laws. So the court delayed the enforcement of its ruling by issuing multiple stays, which gave the EPA time to write a new rule. But on March 23 of this year, President Trump signed into law what's known as the FARM Act, the Fair Ag Reporting Method Act, to modify the statute at issue to include the EPA exemption for farms that have animal waste releases. So basically what Congress did was codify in that law the exemption that EPA previously had that got tied up in the courts. And so it's not an agency authority issue, it's now statute.
And as you say, this has been a key development for the livestock sector, to be certain. Well, we've made our way from number 10 through number 4 on Roger's top 10 list of agricultural law developments of 2018. Roger, we need to stand aside once again, and then we'll be back to cover numbers 3 through 1. Again, Roger McEowen is a professor of agricultural law and taxation at Washburn University and a regular contributor here on Agriculture Today.
What is radon? Home exposure to radon gas is the leading cause of lung cancer death in the United States for non-smokers. In Kansas, 1 in 4 homes will test at or above the EPA action level. The Surgeon General recommends all homes be tested and fixed if necessary. Visit kansasradonprogram.org for more information. Test, fix, save a life. This message brought to you by the Kansas Radon Program, the Kansas Association of Broadcasters, and this station.
This is the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson back with you. And now to top off our look at the top 10 agricultural law and taxation developments of 2018, as assembled by Washburn University Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation, Roger McEowen. And so far, it's been clearly illustrated that this past year marked a considerable number of important developments for our producers. And in fact, Roger, you have documented all of this on your website out of Washburn as part of your regular blog post there. And a little later on, we'll tell folks how they can access that. Meantime, we're up to number 3 on your list. The 2018 Farm Bill. Now, the width and breadth of that legislation is quite far-flung, so as you consider it on your list, what particular features stand out to you?
Well, I've got this at number 3. If this would have been a revolutionary farm bill, it probably would have been number 1, because farm bills do impact farmers pretty much all across the country, except those that are not growing covered crops, but there are fewer and fewer of those compared to a generation ago. But there are differences here, and when you look at ARC and PLC, the selection between those, growers under the old law had to make a one-time election between ARC and PLC for the life of the 2014 Farm Bill. But under the new bill, they're going to make a selection between ARC or PLC for 2019 and 2020. But when you get to 2021, it then becomes an annual selection, with PLC always being the default option. So that's a major difference. Now, the marketing loan rates go up. That's the first across-the-board increase in about 2 decades. The loan rates go up by 13% to 24% for grains and soybeans. The payment limit stays at $900,000. It does not come down. There was a thought that it might drop to $750,000. CRP gets bigger. Working lands program get a makeover. Cover crops are good practice because there are provisions in the crop insurance section of the Farm Bill that are intended to improve acceptance of cover crops as good farming practices. And, of course, there's the hemp provision that's in the Farm Bill now. You've got hemp as a covered commodity.
Well, we're around to the top 2, and not surprisingly, the Waters of the United States rule is still right there in the thick of things. Now, there was a whole assortment of court developments in this past year, and as we stand today with WOTUS, there's this uneven implementation of the rule across the country. That's the current status? Yeah,
that is the current status. And, of course, what the deal here is in what states does the 2015 Obama-era rule apply? And that gets us into having it apply to ephemeral streams and waters being waters of the United States. That's a big issue, in ditches and so forth. Or will the Trump-era rule apply? And there is a mixed bag across the country because this has been in and out of the courts. It's still in the courts. We still have litigation pending in 3 federal district courts across the country. I think this is going to come to a head in 2019. Of course, the U.S. Supreme Court in 2017 said that it's the federal district courts that are going to decide what version of WOTUS applies. You've got the EPA writing a new rule. You had early in 2018 the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously saying that jurisdiction, again, is in the federal courts. That reversed the Sixth Circuit on this issue. In the middle of 2018, you had a district court entering a preliminary injunction barring the WOTUS rule from being implemented in 11 states. So basically where we're sitting on this, with that opinion and a prior decision by the North Dakota Federal District Court that had blocked the rule from taking effect in 13 states, I'm talking about the old rule, the Obama-era rule, we've got about half of the states in the country where the old rule doesn't apply, and the other half of the states where it does apply. And in those states where it does not apply, then we go back to the prior rule prior to that, which basically goes back to a 2006 U.S. Supreme Court decision that tells us how we define what a water of the United States is. So this continues to be tied up in litigation. We're going to have a new rule that the EPA is going to unveil. That's going to get litigated, but at some point in time, this will come to an end, and I think we'll be in a more favorable position than where we started out with under the proposed rule in 2015. But huge issue, impacts farmers and ranchers and rural landowners all over the country.
WOTUS was so high profile this past year, one might have thought it was at the top of your list. It wasn't. However, the Section 199A agricultural deduction, which was unveiled under the new Tax Act, tops your list. Talk about why so.
Well, this is that new 20% pass-through deduction for sole proprietors and partnerships and S corporations, pass-through businesses. You get a 20% deduction. So if your tax rate, let's say, is 24%, then you get your actual rate after your deduction. If you get the full 20%, you're going to reduce that 24% by 20%. So you're going to drop off a little over 4% out of that. That's a pretty nice deduction. This has consumed so much thought, so much discussion. It was clearly the number one topic of interest at all the tax schools that I did throughout 2018, including the KSU tax schools. This impacts just about every farmer or rancher's thought process. Now, whether you change your entity form or not may be a different question, but this is entering into the thought equation as to, well, what do I do? Is there something I can do to take advantage of this? Do I pay myself a wage? Do I increase wages to my employees? Do I change the entire structure of my business? This impacts everything in terms of the tax planning process for farmers and ranchers that are potentially eligible for this. And if somebody's listening and they haven't gotten tax counsel on this, they haven't tried to read up on this to figure out what this is, you need to do so. This is not one of these you want to try to do it yourself, but it is very important.
There's the top 10 list for 2018, and Roger, we would note that you have captured all of this on your blog, as well as a handful of other developments this past year which didn't quite make the list, what you call the almost top 10, but they're of significance as well. All of this, folks, can be found at the website that Roger maintains, washburnlaw.edu/WALTR, and look for the blog section on that page, washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. Roger, thanks for taking the time here to walk us through all of this, and in a couple of weeks we'll get back together with you and see what's perking here in 2019 in the field. Appreciate your time.
Thank you, Eric.
Roger McEowen. He is a professor of agricultural law and taxation at the Washburn University School of Law. Agriculture Today will be back in a few moments on the K-State Radio Network.
Have you ever thought about where your food comes from? If you're thinking the grocery store, think again. Facts show that the American farmer feeds more than 129 people.
They are continually increasing and improving their operations. A wide variety of crops and livestock are grown in Kansas as well as the United States, providing food to your dinner plate.
Next time you see a farmer or rancher, thank them. For more information, contact K-State Research and Extension.
This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen. This is our state, Kansas.
When I handled the piece of firewood to add to the burning fire, instead of tossing it into the flames, I laid it aside.
That's Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
We're still early enough in the year to make resolutions, deciding on things we will do in the new year 2019. I was thinking about that when I handled a piece of firewood to add to the fireplace, and instead of tossing it into the flames, I laid it aside. By doing that, I opened up a Pandora box of things I once wanted to do. But I now know I will never do any more. It is the price one pays for getting older, and maybe wiser. What I'd always wanted to do is, as you know, to build a house on the farm. But that was dropped fairly early for health reasons, even though we now have a good windbreak to protect the site I plan to build on. It's not an issue, no resolution there. As I walk, I see the house I designed. I know it would fit the site as a friend, a builder, and I surveyed the site. But to follow up on the idea was to build a simple cabin. One Christmas, there were several books on how to build a cabin under the tree, as kids and grandkids thought that to be a great idea. The cabin was a different matter. Accessibility was an issue, but there are many locations where a cabin would be a great addition. There are out-of-the-way places in the woods or places near a quiet farm pond on the range. At one time, while slowly clearing the broken, mighty branches of a huge oak, I looked at the big stump and visualized a treehouse for adults on top of it. It never came off the ground, or should I say, off the stump. The idea of a treehouse cabin was a neat idea, I thought. Apparently not practical. My grandson, who was with me at the time, loved the idea. He saw himself living there before I ever built it. If he had lived there, where would I have gone? You can't evict family. The cabin would have been the same thing. The only difference would be from my place, one would never hear the whistle of a train, like Thoreau did when he built his cabin. Planes would fly over, pulling their vapor trails. The cabin would have been very rustic. Now it would have been mice-proof, rat-proof, squirrel-proof, snake-proof, and ant-proof. All of those. To fill the need, I at one time bought an old quality camper and placed it among the trees. To pull it in place, I needed to be close to the farm road. It had a good location, and we, the kids, have enjoyed it. And there are enough stories to tell and share to have memories. The camper was sold years ago to a friend who needed it, and for the right price. We cleaned it one more time. Mice and squirrels had invaded the wooden structure. Anneke washed and ironed the curtains, and I made sure it had roadworthy tires to make the 25-mile trip to its new location. Inside, the newly constructed barn on his place. So much for my dream about a rustic cabin. I have the perfect location near a small, wild pond. Oh, I'm still dreaming and laughing. The dreaming I like. I walk the creek and see the perfect stone to use as foundation for the fire pit, and see the big slabs to use for steps and patio. Of course, a small patio is a must, as would be the fire pit. To sit on a summer evening and see the stars while swaying in a hammock strung between growing trees close by. The cabin would be rustic, inside and outside. The door hinges would be metal, not leather straps. Remember, I want to keep the critters out. And I have a whole box full of old hinges for gates and doors, rusted, but all oiled and working again. Who has used them? They are old. Just thinking on the porch and listening to the rain fall on the tin roof. Then, after the rain, the birds come out, and there would have been a small corral for the horses. Yes, there would have been pegs to hang things on. And that, my dear listener, is when the thoughts all started again. Remember, I was throwing wood on the fire in the fireplace. The little booklet, Reverence for Wood by Eric Sloan, is an inspiration to me. I'm sure the small booklet would have gone to the rough shelf in my cabin. One of these days I must have the booklet re-glued the modern way, as the old way, old glue, caused it to fall apart. Anyway, there is the chapter describing how to make wooden pegs for the needed coat hangers. No way would I go to Home Depot and buy store-bought hooks. No way. No, the hooks I want, and I've laid aside to make some from natural-grown branches which show a Y. I have several laying on the workbench, and while I will never build the cabin, no need to, I will cut these natural hooks from the branches laid aside, and I will mount them on an old 2x6 board long enough to span the studs between the soft board in the garage of the house, just near the steps from going inside. There I will attach the board as a reminder of a perfect dream. Have the dreams, have hope, and work hard. Happy and a good new year to all.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University with his weekly commentary on life in rural Kansas. That'll do it for our Wednesday edition. Thanks for tuning in, as always. Eric Atkinson here. This has been Agriculture Today over the K-State Radio Network.